All right. So, got in trouble with the London trap, threw all of your pieces at the king, got in an equal position, lost it, and then they flagged. All right. So, you're on the black side of this London system, got into a trap, threw some pieces, which probably made sense. I'm going to do a quick playthrough of the game before doing a more thinking through of the game. While I do my playthrough, if you've got any particular question about the game, you can let us know what your question is. Okay, here we see again this bishop coming out here. So there's a question, does white have real pressure or not? Bishop d6, knight takes, pawn takes, check here. King comes out. His name is Kingg-Iss-Comingg, but it's Amanda's king who's coming to the center. Go king, go. Good move. Interesting that these queens are facing each other without trading. You seldom see players not trade queens or not trade pieces, period, when they're looking at each other like that. Nice. Oh, that rook's sort of trapped in there, but I guess it can get out. Amanda's king is coming for the second time this game, right? Amanda's activating the king in the endgame. White's king is still not coming. King supports the death penalty for White's a5 pawn. And here, White lost on time, I guess. Amanda says White was winning again here. Although, it's complicated, but I suppose White could simplify by getting rid of the bishop, or White could take the f7 pawn. And White's better, though the game still has to be played out. Okay. So, Amanda, do you have any questions about this? I, off the top of my head, would think of two learning points for you in this game. One would be how to handle that opening idea of bishop b5 from White. Basically, how dangerous was it? Could you defend against it, or did you have to not allow it? And then, yeah, great, good question. And Amanda's asking me about exactly that question. And then the second thing that I would like to point out is just one detail of how you could have fought in the middle game, which was to go after the d4 pawn with your knight. Once you were in that endgame where you were down a rook against a piece, obviously you still had chances, right? It's like if it were a grandmaster game, White might be winning. But since we're not grandmasters, there was still some room for some back and forth, and you could have gone after this d4 pawn, which really, I think, would improve your position a lot. Okay, so those are the two things we want to get to. Let's start with the opening trap. So bishop b5 comes from the opponent threatening this. So this knight's under pressure. You didn't defend it in extra time, and White took, which at this point we're already in the trap. So let's look here at moves you could play to defend this and figure out how bad is this situation here for this knight. So you could defend it with the rook, right? Two attackers, two defenders. White can increase pressure with queen a4. Three attackers, two defenders. So you may need to defend it at this point. The bishop can't get back. The knight can't get over there. So it's only the queen that can do anything about this situation. If she goes to c7, that's going to be losing as well. That's a good trap to know, that the queen can't go to either of these squares to defend c6 when there's a bishop on f4. So we're going to have to play queen b6 in this case to defend from the side, also defending these pawns. And now let's see if White's got any strong move here. Amanda, I don't see it yet. If white doesn't have a good move here, then you'll defend it against these threats, and it won't even be an opening trap. White needs to either bring one more piece to attack c6, or bring one piece to disrupt any of the defenders of that knight. So, like, you know, pawn takes pawn always has to be calculated. If this knight could get to, like, c4, d5 or something. I don't see anything yet. At the moment, pawn takes, you can take with the bishop, which is nice because it's developing. The sooner you castle, the sooner, like, your knight will be allowed to move. And so white's going to run out of time to land a blow, right? White can attack this piece as much as they want as long as it can't move. See comments many times about attacking things that can't move. As long as it can't move, white's having fun just beating up on it, right? But once you castle, white's time is going to be up. And they're going to have to either, you know, trade or back off or something. dc5 here. We'll just look at threatening moves, basically. Here. Again, this move here might be a trap because of, I don't know, something like knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. I guess it works out there. Knight c4, attacking the queen, pawn takes, bishop takes, just preventing black from castling. Looks fairly unpleasant for black, actually. Not quite a tactic. I mean, it's a tactic. It just is for position, not for material. Okay, anyway, I'm going to play a simpler move, just bishop e7, just tucking my piece, or your piece. Black's piece, since I look at this from a just sort of, you know, chess situation. All right. Now, how does white go about more pressure? Need more pressure. I don't see it. I don't see any problem for black here. Other moves here for white. I don't see anything, Amanda. I mean, black needs a whole nother move before they can do something. So we've got 2 moves for white to generate a threat. I mean, I still just need to develop. And what am I doing? Coming here to maybe go here? Now I've brought the white knight to attack me. That was bad. That was bad. Okay, I got the bishop pair for white. That's a little bit annoying. Bishop back here just to keep the piece. Now it's dangling. I just want to keep the bishop pair and retreat. This is maybe like a tiny advantage for white here. I don't know on which move you mean b4, Joel, but probably not here because b4, queen c3. Can I get away with this and maybe sack my pawn somehow? But my bishop's got nowhere to go. That's why I didn't go for this line. Let me try this. Shoot, defending this. You know, black's position doesn't look too bad here. I know I sacked an exchange. You may not be pumped about this. And there was nothing like clear about what I did. Knight e4 allows rook b1. Let me do this first so I don't allow rook b1. All right, I'll threaten f2 and c3. Okay. Maybe this is too advanced or whatever for 1000 rating, but this position I would be interested to play for black. I like this idea of grabbing space with c4, sacking exchange, you know, having this bishop on d3, knight on e4, probably winning back a pawn. This pawn's really strong. I like this approach. Anyway, without getting too far into it, I guess that was unnecessary. I'll say this. It looks like in this position here, where white goes after c6, you can defend it with the most straightforward defending moves using the two pieces you have that can get there. And you should be okay. So rook c8, and then if they go queen a4, queen b6. You support this point, and then you try and get castled. The position should be absolutely acceptable, Amanda. As long as you can defend c6 successfully, white's eventually going to have to trade off one of these pieces on c6, and they'll have played these sort of like mildly aggressive moves for nothing. You know, so you will actually eliminate white's opening advantage, or white has eliminated their own opening advantage by going for an attack that they couldn't actually break through with. So that beats off this attack, and that says that up to here, you can play your opening exactly as you played it. You can repeat this if you want in the future. And then just defend this piece or square. See, Micro? Amanda knows about an exchange sack and has done one. You guys have to, it's hard to keep up with the times, but low-rated players know more and more like mind-blowing things about chess. It's really just like outside of what we could expect, you know, 5 years ago and 20 years ago. This is one of the reasons why I just think people who talk about rating inflation are off their rockers. When people say like, "Oh no, like, you know, Timur Radjabov can't play chess better than Anatoly Karpov did just because he's rated 90 points higher." Oh, yes, he can, my friends. Oh, yes, he can. Because compare 1,000 players now and 30 years ago, right? And compare 1,500 players now and 30 years ago. If the 1,500s are better than the 1,500s were and the 1,000s are better than the 1,000s were, then when Timur Radjabov beats a 2,600 GM, that 2,600 GM is like amazingly good. That 2,600 GM that Timur Radjabov can beat is like tougher than Karpov's opposition. And by getting a 2790 rating, Timur is beating those 2,600 players with an even higher percentage. So anyway, so there you have it, folks. 1,000 players know about positional exchange sacrifices. Okay, out of curiosity, since we've broached the subject, Amanda, if I show you this position with the bishop on d3 and knight on e4, do you like this position for black or not? Do you have any sort of evaluative instinct? Any first impression of this position like, oh, that's pretty, or, whoa, yuck? Okay, fair enough. I think you're right, but it's complicated enough that I don't know. It's just my working sense, you know, my first impression followed by looking at it for 30 seconds is that I like black's position. I think as long as any rook b1 move we can just take with the bishop. That's why I didn't like, you know, the first time I played this position, I played knight e4, and then I was like, oh, it's complicated. White goes to the b file, you know, and then takes the a pawn. But if I put the bishop on this side where I don't allow rook b1, as long as I don't allow rook b1, I don't see why white's rooks would be better than black's knight and bishop that are coming in here. It's my take. All right. All right, so now let's look at a second thing from this game. So, yeah, because your king's exposed and white's queen is on a good square, you're going to have to go into an endgame here with a piece against a rook, right? Which is going to be tough. Karpov was definitely the best player in, like, tournaments, right? From, like, 1975 to 85. So he was a great player. I mean, every great player probably got lucky in some of their games and unlucky in others. And, you know, because they were good, they probably looked a little bit luckier than people who weren't good because they were secretly making some of their own luck all the time outside of what we can see or understand at the surface. Okay. So you're going to have to play an endgame like this. My first thought in a position like this, Amanda, would be to put the rook on b8 because these pawns are isolated. But after rook b8, b5, our rook is contained, right, by this structure here. And knight c3 is coming, which is going to support this even more. So that doesn't really achieve anything. So perhaps more interesting is the move you played, which got Opfashach's stamp of approval. Now for white, I mean, again, white can answer this. Kingg-Iss-Comingg, if you ever check this VOD or if you're here with us right now, I would play a fairly automatic h4 against the h5 move because I'm just stopping Amanda's plan of improving her rook and holding the king's position together. At the moment, even though there are no queens on the board, if we let Amanda play h4 like in the game, okay, she played rook h6 first and then played h4 next move. If we let her play h4, black's got rook, knight, and bishop sort of attacking a king with like a couple pawns in front of him. So white will have a way to like use this knight and rook to defend somewhat. It's not like white's going to get wrecked or anything. But we can see that black has a kind of like pressure and initiative against the king side once black plays h4. So this is like a very strong threat to develop the rook and improve black's position. If you can, you want to stop your opponent's good moves. And you can here, right? Just h4. Pawn chain on the dark squares looks fine at the moment. Amanda might play either g5 or f6, g5, continuing to try and create something interesting on this side of the board. I think that's justified because she's got two minor pieces on that side of the board right now, sort of like briefly sort of a local advantage in terms of force on that side of the board. And she wants to try and do something since she's down material. And again, the rook b8, b5 option didn't do much. The other idea that strikes me here would be like a6 with the idea of playing rook b8 next by stopping b5. Again, I mean, white has the resources to prevent my idea. Knight c3, defending b5 in advance so that on rook b8, white can play b5. So if white can read my idea, then, you know, white has the advantage in this endgame. Amanda knows that, right? So h5, if white sees the idea, they can stop it with h4. You know, rook b8, if they see it, they can play b5. Perhaps subtle is a6, and some people might not read that the idea is to play rook b8. But again, if they see it, they can play knight c3, and they can stop it. That's right, Amanda. That was exactly the right approach. So you played rook h6 here. As I said, h4 immediately would be preferable. b5, h4, f3, knight takes e3. Now, you need to recognize that this is a huge moment, and it sounds like you kind of did. When your opponent gives you that e3 pawn, their whole pawn structure is now chaos. A moment ago, white had a rook and a pawn against a bishop. Your prospects, you know, GM or computer speaking, are very, very poor at the moment. But you're putting pressure on your opponent. And notice how quickly it goes from you putting pressure to your opponent playing like a mistake. Different players react differently to pressure. It's not to say that every game against every player you should always like try and put on pressure. But here you're in a bad position, so you might as well usually try and put on pressure. You do, and you immediately get a mistake, and that will happen a fair amount. So you play knight takes e3. The thing to realize here is that with f3, white's lost like their central pawn chain, but they've got space for their rook and knight to defend the king side. So now the spot that I noticed the moment white plays this is d4. And you didn't switch gears to this d4 pawn, and that's the second thing I want to point out to you about this game. So in the game, you bring in your rook, right? We've got this sequence, but all it does is it leads to trading rooks. Who does trading rooks help? I think that's rhetorical because I think that you know that. The rook trade is making it easier for white to eventually win this endgame. Pardon my hiccups. So that says that when you came in with the rook and kept coming after the king side here, you were continuing to pursue the king side play instead of switching gears. When your opponent played e3, rook f2, they gave up part of the center to cover the king side. You keep attacking the king side, they can defend that now, right? So now you lose a tempo on your bishop. Because your bishop's still hanging, you don't have a choice to keep the rook on the board, so you have to trade it. Now you have to spend a move saving your bishop, right? And now white would have had time to try and defend the d4 pawn. Instead of this, what I would propose is I would trade once, although you don't even have to trade. Like, you could even just leave the pawn here. Because honestly, it just gives white this option here to trade off your rook. I might just leave the tension even, Amanda. I'm not sure of this. We're not going to go into it in too much detail, but maybe even knight c2 without trading on g3. Maybe trade and then knight c2. But in either case, what I want to talk about is this move. This move here wins the pawn on d4. Well, actually, maybe rook d1 is messy. Yeah, rook d1 is messy. But this is the right direction to look at. This is the right direction to look at, is to start looking at this isolated pawn. Okay? Switch up directions and angles. Say, okay, the king side is covered. Let me go after a different weakness now because they've lost the pawn chain. So on most normal moves from white, you can just take back this pawn. And I would say by now, it's not like this was a deliberate exchange sack suddenly. White still technically has a small advantage at like a GM level, but like, you know, to get back to the Joel point, if I had this position as white, I would not think I was easily winning. I would think like I might have an edge, but good Lord, this position is hard to play. That would be the evaluation I'd be working from at this point. Because black has legitimate strength in the center. Right? Legitimate strength in the center, and you have a pawn and a bishop against a rook. That's like a positional, that's a material deficit that's fairly minor or minimal, right? Often comparable to being down one pawn. So if you've got some positional compensation, it's easy to imagine that black's okay. And you've got a strong center, and your danger is, you know, the opponent's pawn majority over here, but the b2 pawn doesn't look like a good pawn. Now, the other thing white could play is they could play rook d1. Let's give you one puzzle here. And I'm going to open this puzzle to Amanda and anybody else rated under 1200. So folks over 1200, I know some of you struggle to follow this direction. Folks over 1200, please don't give the answer in chat for at least 1.5 to 2 minutes here, okay? Let's give everyone under 1200 a chance to think about this on their own. Anyone under 1200, you can try and give an answer. If you see someone else under 1200 give an answer, they might be right or wrong, right? They're under 1200, who knows? So it shouldn't spoil you continuing to think about it for yourself. So what should black do if white plays rook to d1 in response to knight c2? How do we play this position? I've told you our focal point is we've noticed this like weak pawn. We're trying to make some use of it. What do you think? And while you guys are thinking about that puzzle, I'm going to answer a previous question from Pumpkin the Cat. Pumpkin the Cat in this position here, I think, was talking about playing bishop g6 and knight f5 to attack g3. My response, Pumpkin the Cat, is white now has the resources to defend the king side. They've got king g2, they've got rook g2, they've got knight f1, they've got space for the pieces to cover the king side. I want you to shift focus to this weakness. Okay, bishop g6 and knight f5, white can deal with over here. Oh, you're still going after this pawn. Okay, I love you. Good idea. Knight c2 is going to be faster than knight f5. So that'll be the only reason why we'll do this. But bishop g6, knight f5 attacking both. Cool idea. You win, Pumpkin. All right, so now back to our puzzle for the moment. Knight c2, white plays rook d1. And now, players under 1200. Give your best guess at this point, even if you don't have like a real answer. Give your best guess of what you would play, because Micro is going to give us an answer pretty soon. He's going to spoil the fun. Or he or she or they, I don't know, Micro. So if you have an idea for black and you're not sure if it's right or wrong, hit us with it. Hit us with it under 1200s. So we've got f6 to be followed by this. So if we can't win this pawn, we're going to try f6, something from white. I'm just going to mark time, e5. So we're trying to use the knight to crack this square, build strength in the center with this pawn chain. Cool idea, Far Eastern. Cool idea. Cool idea. It has the general worry that this rook is opposite the king, which is how we're trying to stop black from playing knight d4 is based on this file. So when you play e5, the same thing happens, that when white trades, they open up this file and then they captured this pawn, right? So that's unfortunate. Did any of you under 1200s notice that the reason not to take on d4 right here is knight takes c4? Did anybody see the sneaky rook? That was the idea of the rook. Was knight d4, knight c4. That's why we need something more complicated. Yeah, that's the issue, right? So that's why we want to come up with some kind of other idea, right? So we had one suggestion of f6, e5, which I'm saying falls into the same problem, right? That when white trades this pawn, you get knight c4. And then we had a suggestion of knight e3, chasing the rook away somewhere, right? And then we just want to come right back in. Someone else gave us that suggestion. I think Chess Weaves was looking at that. That's a pretty solid idea, right, folks? How is white supposed to cover this? Does this rook have anywhere great to go to get out of stuff? The bishop's covering b1, knight's covering f1. On e1 or a1, there's knight c2, just simply repeating, basically. There's no other white piece that seems to have a good way of getting to d4, right? So this is a pretty good idea from Weave. So this might be the best try, so that when the knight goes to c2, it's not attacking the rook's attacking the knight. Now we've got a chance as white to try and launch some kind of tactic of our own, right? What do we have? Knight e4, maybe? Knight c4, opening up the rook. G4. G4, the bishop can just... I was going to say drop back. It can also drop forward, right? Pawn defends, bishop defends, knight. That's not going to get broken up. Knight e4 looks interesting, but doesn't work. Takes here. Oops. That didn't work. Also on knight e4, black could maybe just take the pawn. Save the knight while taking the pawn. So knight e4 doesn't work at all, it seems. So it looks like knight e3, knight c2, and just back and forth. Black could probably get a draw or force white to sack the pawn. So that's a very, very nice idea, right? Now going back here, after rook d1, there's an even stronger move for black than knight e3. But I give 100% full credit for knight e3. Okay, chess weaves, you get full credit on this move. But as Basil said, and before Basil, somebody else, some user with some string of numbers who I didn't recognize, was saying bishop d3 is even stronger. Basically, the bishop and pawn just start defending each other, and they're taking away all the territory from the white pieces and also blocking this file, right? This file now stops at d3, which is a very strong point. And white's got no move to stop knight d4. So Amanda really gets into the game with this. So that's the second big thing to learn from this game, Amanda, is when you should switch from your kingside play over to attacking this d4 target. It really, really, like, completely gets you back into the game. Shatters white's position quite a bit. That was cool, right? And you see this f3 move, it's giving white space to defend this side of the board, but it's weakening e3, d4, the central squares. You'll see this a lot in other situations, Amanda, not just like endgames and things, but in middle games, somebody will be setting up an attack against the king side. Do I have a game from today that can show that kind of idea? I can just create a position to show you this idea real fast. If only my mouse were a little bit, not my mouse, but, you know, my skills with my mouse. Whoa! Boo-da-boom, boo-da-boom, boo-da-boom. Sorry, A3. So there are a lot of positions where when somebody's being threatened on this side of the board, they play f5 or f6, similar, f6 or f5. And the point of it is they create space for their pieces to defend that side of the board. When somebody does that, you often need to switch from trying to attack their king side, which is now defensible, to attacking the squares in the center, right? So you see things like here, here. We look at this, right? They come here, look at this. You know? Because if you keep trying to checkmate over here, right? Like knight g5. Rook here. Queen h3. By definition, this f5 move gave your opponent resources for defending that area, right? The bishop could eliminate the knight if it needed to. The rook's got space to cover stuff. And now it's like, well, what am I doing as white, right? I'm trying to force something that is no longer logical, right? The f5 move was a trade-off. The f5 move said black now has enough space for their pieces to provide defensive resources for the king, but it weakened our position in the center. It weakened previously the base of our center, which was also what was preventing white from pushing forward. So now you see I approach it by looking at, I switch. I just quickly switch from what was their weakness to what is now their weakness. Okay, and hopefully most of you do see how that's related to what happened this game, right? Amanda's threatening to take, maybe come into h2, maybe at some point play bishop e4, depending on what this knight does, right? But white plays f3, and now rook f2 covering the side of the board. Now knight f1. Like, there's room for the pieces to cover the king side. So we need to switch away from that and go after the same two squares that are coming apart in the center. F5 intercepts the bishop-queen battery far eastern, yes. But it's deliberately also to make space for the defensive pieces. Okay, so if we go back to this position here, and the position where I played F5 for black, right? Sometimes you could just play G6. But if you play G6, white's undeterred about attacking on the king side, right? White comes here, 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 right? They still think that they've got chances to get into those squares. You know, sometimes you defend with knight F8, defending H7 in some other position, right? Or you could have played knight F6 instead of trading on C3. So F5, yes, it's like a choice about stopping queen H7. But when you're choosing as black between F5, G6, and different defensive options, when you see somebody play F5, if they had more than one option, if they had a choice rather than a forced move, then they're probably doing this partly because it gives their pieces room to cover that side of the board. Bishop E8 even, right? Sometimes there's a queen on D8 which can go to E8 and cover the king side. So it'll be a move to gain space on the king side to provide room for defensive resources to be transferred there. When that happens, you need to switch to looking at weaknesses in the center that are created by the pawn pushing. So that's my little twin from the end game position to the middle game position, just to show that I think this piece of knowledge or advice I'm giving Amanda will crop up in some very different situations and be of value there. So I think at a 1,000 level, if a 1,000 rated player can notice where the opponent has a potential weakness and start organizing their pieces to go in that direction and attack it, that's already really good. It's a fairly advanced point to notice when your opponent's weakness is no longer a weakness and you need to switch to targeting something else. That's a tough pivot to make. But that's exactly what happens here when white plays F3 and then rook F2. We have to pivot. White's covered the king side. And people will often say, that's their weakness, I'll keep attacking it, right? You've got some great idea to attack the opponent's king. You make a weakness. You're like, yes, I'm a genius. I'll just keep going for it. But sometimes you actually have to like revise it. Sometimes they've covered the king. You need to switch to a different direction. All right, so let's grab this game here and wrap up today's postmortem. How about estimating an opponent's potential threats quickly? Do you calculate, or can you quickly determine it? I mean, Daxipu, maybe you know the sort of like rule of thumb where you look at attackers versus defenders. That can tell you if, like, generally speaking, there's a strategic basis for an attack to be successful or not. In terms of little tactical flare-ups, you can keep track of how many of your own pieces are tactically vulnerable. That could be a piece that can't move, a piece that's undefended, a piece that can barely move, a piece that's barely defended, and then just like pieces that have like hidden attacks or are lined up. You can find out all about that in my Tactical Elements video on YouTube or on chess.com. So if you've got a lot of bad tactical elements, the odds are high that your opponent has a tactic. And then you're on high alert and expecting that their threats and attacks are going to work. Yeah, Diablo, in this position here, it's not clear that white has any real advantage once black gets, let's say, rook d1, bishop d3, and gets this pawn. It's going to be rook against bishop and pawn, but the bishop and pawn unit are so strong and centralized, and without any fully open file for the white pieces yet, it's not clear that white's rook is going to be better than black's pieces. That's why I was holding off on hg3, because that gives white an actually open file to try and like trade our rook or get their rooks to an open file. So I actually like not trading on g3, just leaving this tension and going about our business in the center. So yeah, Diablo, I mean, I don't know exactly what the evaluation is, but obviously white's advantage has been minimized here, right? You'd like black here, yeah. Yeah, that said, Diablo, it is complicated. Breams has just found a move that I was looking at here, which is this move here. Very interesting, defending d4, right? And if pawn takes, rook takes. So you can see the position is still pretty intense, right? With this move coming. So when we calculate this, you know, maybe it doesn't even work out for black. Who knows? It's so complicated. And we might have to play knight e3. Rook comes here. Yeah, there's always one more tricky move somewhere, right? Takes, here, here, here. Maybe knight c5 in here is maybe winning for white. Who knows? Maybe king g2, trying to trap the knight. There's complicated variations. We did calculate more this knight e3 move and determined that it was basically a forced draw. Or sorry, not a forced draw. That white couldn't defend d4. They would have to either go back and forth or let black take d4 in the knight e3 c2 variation. But we didn't calculate everything exhaustively. You know, because there's like a limit to how long a variation is appropriate for a 1,000 rated player. And we try and do the postmortems. Each game in the postmortem, I try and switch the level of the commentary and explanations to the level of the two players in the game, right? So I wasn't calculating super long variations too much, at least. Or hopefully I didn't.